At 55, he wakes up without an alarm. At 25, he woke up with purpose. At 55, time belongs to him. At 25, he managed it carefully. At 55, there's no rush. At 25, every hour was used wisely. At 55, money works for him. At 25, he worked for his money. At 55, stress is gone. At 25, discipline replaced comfort. At 55, he lives on his own terms. At 25, he sacrificed short-term pleasure. At 55, his life feels light. At 25, his habits were strong. At 55, he chooses what to do. At 25, he chose wisely every day. At 55, freedom feels real. At 25, he built it slowly. At 55, he travels without worry. At 25, he avoided unnecessary expenses. At 55, his mornings are peaceful. At 25, his nights were disciplined. At 55, he enjoys life fully. At 25, he delayed gratification. At 55, his income never stops. At 25, he invested consistently. At 55, his future is secure. At 25, he planned ahead. At 55, he smiles without stress. At 25, he worked without excuses. At 55, he owns his time. At 25, he respected it. At 55, he is financially free. At 25, he built financial discipline. At 55, life feels effortless. At 25, effort was everything. At 55, he enjoys simple moments. At 25, he made smart choices. At 55, there's no pressure left. At 25, pressure built him. At 55, he rests without guilt. At 25, he earned that rest. At 55, he lives without fear. At 25, he faced hard decisions. At 55, everything feels calm. At 25, he stayed consistent. At 55, his life reflects discipline. At 25, he built that discipline daily. At 55, he enjoys true freedom. Because early retirement at 55 doesn't begin at 55. It begins at 25.